Every national and world leader is judged by their policies and actions, and some are treated harshly during their tenure and afterward by history. In some cases, historical research and hindsight reassesses their role in either a positive or a negative light. U.S. presidents are no exception, and Herbert Hoover was a man of many contradictions, but he was a man of his time, and in some ways ahead of his time. Some of his actions have been praised as extraordinary on a humanitarian level, while other actions caused some to demonize him. Let's look at his career and examine both arguments. Who was Herbert Hoover? Why was he controversial to some and praised by others? What actions did he take to try and help humanity? What did he do to cause so many to detest him?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Herbert Hoover was born on August 10, 1874, in West Branch, Iowa, into a Quaker family, but he grew up in Oregon. He was later one of the first graduates of the newly established Stanford University in 1895. Hoover became a mining expert and worked in the Sierra Nevada mountains following a period of low-wage excavation. Mining engineer Louis Janin hired him as a mine scout due to his expertise in detecting high-grade ore. Hoover spent a year inspecting and selecting locations for mines until he was recruited by the London-based mining company Bewick Moring and Company, which had gold mines in Australia. Hoover was paid a $5,000 salary, equivalent to about $200,120 today, working in the Coolgardie and Murchison of the Great Victoria Desert, where evaluating mines for quality and safety was his job. He was able to persuade the Bewick Company to purchase the Sons of Gwalia gold mine. Later, it became one of the most successful gold mines in Australia. Due to the rising labor disputes with local miners, Hoover brought in many Italian immigrants, reducing operating costs and avoiding labor strikes. It was during this time that he developed his opposition to workers' compensation packages and minimum wage scales as they cut into corporate profits. For his efforts, he was made a junior partner in 1898, working for the manager, Ernest Williams. While in Australia, Hoover also co-founded the Zinc Corporation near Broken Hill, New South Wales, where he developed the froth flotation process used to extract zinc from lead-silver ore, becoming the world's first selective ore differential flotation plant. Hoover later took a consulting job in China, where he established gold mines near Tianjin for Bewick and the Chinese Engineering and Mining Company. Hoover warned his superiors that, quote, Chinese workers were inefficient and racially inferior, but made recommendations to improve the lot of the Chinese worker, seeking to end the practice of imposing long-term servitude contracts and to institute reforms for workers based on merit. End quote. Hoover found himself trapped with hundreds of other foreigners when the Boxer Rebellion began. See our video on that subject and legendary Marine Daniel Daly at the Battle of Tien Tsin. Once effective control was reestablished in China, Hoover was appointed as the operating partner in late 1901. Given his expertise, Hoover assisted the British Burma Corporation that produced silver, lead, and zinc at the Namtu Baldwin mine. He later went to Russia and helped increase copper production in Kizhstan, Russia, through the use of pyritic smelting. Hoover also supervised mining operations in the Altai Mountains that, according to Hoover, developed probably the greatest and richest single body of ore known in the world. Hoover was also very business savvy, and he made smart investments all over the world with offices in London, New York City, Paris, San Francisco, Petrograd, modern-day Leningrad, several locations in Australia, and in Mandalay, Burma. By 1914, Hoover was a very wealthy man with an estimated personal fortune of $4 million, which is about $121.67 million in today's money. After seeing the hard, back-breaking work of the miners, Hoover changed his opinion on labor and came to endorse 8-hour workdays and organized labor. He wanted workers to have rights. When World War I broke out in 1914, Hoover organized and headed the Commission for Relief in Belgium, one of many international relief organizations that provided food to occupied Belgium, while also serving as President Woodrow Wilson's director of the U.S. Food Administration, and he also served as the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. See our video on Woodrow Wilson also. Hoover even traveled to Europe and diplomatically negotiated with the British, French, and even the Germans to allow famine relief to enter Belgium until 1917, when the U.S. declared war on the Central Powers. Some of Hoover's detractors later insinuated that he made secret deals to increase his own personal wealth at the expense of the starving Belgians, but no evidence has ever surfaced to prove that. He was already one of the richest men in America anyway. When World War I ended, Hoover led the American Relief Administration, providing food to millions of people who were starving in Central and Eastern Europe. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept blame for the war, although Germany did not start it, and was still forced to pay reparations until 1984. To Woodrow Wilson's and Hoover's credit, they opposed the imposition of the reparations and guilt clause imposed upon Germany, who alone was being financially punished. They both saw a future crisis in the making, and they were right. Hyperinflation and food shortages were the result, the rise of communism and National Socialism, and 15 nations involved in the war owed huge sums of money that they had borrowed from the United States. Britain and France were the two largest debtors. The French claimed that they would pay their debts with reparations money from Germany. The U.S. found this unacceptable, as reparations and war debts were two separate issues. The American public, as well as the bankers who funded the war and were the real reason Woodrow Wilson took America into the war to protect those investments, demanded that Allied nations repay what they borrowed, regardless of Germany's reparations. However, France and Great Britain finally admitted that without reparations from Germany, which included taking all of the coal, iron, and precious minerals which Germany did not have an abundance of, they would not be able to pay off their debts. Hoover condemned the Bolshevik Revolution and warned President Wilson against becoming involved in the Russian Civil War, as he viewed the White Russian forces little better than the Bolsheviks and feared the possibility of a protracted U.S. involvement. Hoover's financial and political positions, as well as his wartime humanitarian service, made him a favorite of many progressives, and he unsuccessfully sought the Republican nomination in the 1920 U.S. presidential election. However, he was unsuccessful in that bid, but other challenges presented themselves. According to varying estimates, the Russian famine of 1921-22 resulting from World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Russian Civil War that followed claimed 6 million people, but Hoover again jumped into action. His managing the ARA likely saved millions of lives, although once again his detractors accused him of being a communist sympathizer, and when he was asked if he was not helping the communists, Hoover stated, 20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed. All of the European nations gave him credit for saving lives, and in July 1922, the Soviet author Maxim Gorky told Hoover that your help will enter history as a unique, gigantic achievement, worthy of the greatest glory, which will long remain in the memory of millions of Russians whom you have saved from death. By 1924, the German economy was collapsing and endangering the international financial system. The Allies agreed to a commission chaired by American banker and politician Charles Dawes as a remedy. The resulting Dawes Plan reduced German reparations payments and encouraged U.S. banks to loan money to Germany to help rebuild German industry, on the assumption that a stronger German economy would make the reparations payments more manageable. Then Hoover became the Secretary of Commerce and promoted the use of radios in homes, and he played a key role in the organization, development, and regulation of radio broadcasting. One of Hoover's more controversial moments was when he helped pass the Radio Act of 1927. This allowed the government to intervene and abolish radio stations that were deemed non-useful to the public. In effect, strict censorship and regulation. This saw massive resistance from members of both houses of Congress as well as the independent radio station owners. Hoover once again became involved during the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, which broke the banks and levees of the lower Mississippi Valley in early 1927, resulting in the flooding of millions of acres and leaving 1.5 million people displaced from their homes. The Commerce Department was not legally responsible for disaster relief, but the governors of 6 states along the Mississippi River specifically asked President Calvin Coolidge to appoint Hoover to coordinate the response to the flood. Coolidge agreed that it was not a federal responsibility, and he refused to have government involvement at first, until public and political pressure became intense, and he then appointed Hoover to chair a special committee to help the region. In response, Hoover established over 100 tent cities and a fleet of more than 600 vessels and raised $17 million, which is equivalent to $300 million today. Hoover was praised for addressing the crisis, but he was later condemned for suppressing the reports of blacks being abused in refugee camps. Hoover was supported in this suppression by black leader Robert Russell Moulton, who was promised unprecedented influence once Hoover became president. Hoover's enemies claimed that he was bribing prominent blacks to tamp down the segregation and violence against blacks, who were abused economically and even legally. As president, he signed the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929, establishing the Federal Farm Board in order to stabilize farm prices, which was not universally well received. Hoover had also campaigned on America not getting involved in foreign conflicts, and when he became president, he released the Clark Memorandum, a rejection of the Roosevelt Corollary and a move towards non-interventionism in Latin America. But Hoover still intervened in the Dominican Republic and sent warships to El Salvador to support the government against a left-wing revolution. But Hoover did manage to end America's involvement in the Banana Wars, ending the occupation of Nicaragua and nearly bringing an end to the occupation of Haiti. Hoover wanted to develop privately owned commercial air travel, which was growing in Europe and would be indirectly supported by government subsidies. Part of that was the creation of emergency landing fields, improving safety by airport runways required to be equipped with lights and radio beams, and encouraging farmers to make use of planes for crop dusting. Hoover also helped establish the early Federal Aviation Administration, which gave the federal government the responsibility to inspect planes and license pilots, and he oversaw the growth of military aviation. A global financial crisis was looming by 1929, and American industrialist businessman Owen D. Young agreed to reduce German war payments. The other major threat was excessive speculation that had raised stock prices far beyond their value. Coolidge and Hoover were warned that a failure to curb speculation would lead to one of the greatest financial catastrophes that this country has ever seen. But both presidents were reluctant to become involved with the workings of the Federal Reserve System created by Woodrow Wilson, which regulated banks. The stock market collapse forced Hoover to take immediate action, and he gathered business and labor leaders, asking them to avoid wage cuts and work stoppages while the country faced what he believed would be a short recession similar to the Depression of 1920 and 21. In another desperate move, Hoover persuaded the railroads and public utilities to increase spending on public construction and maintenance projects, while the Federal Reserve promised to cut interest rates to relieve the pressure. Hoover secured $100 million from Congress to continue the Federal Farm Board lending and purchasing policies. designed to prevent a cycle of deflation and provide a fiscal stimulus. But Hoover then opposed congressional proposals to provide federal relief to the unemployed. Hoover did not believe that the federal government should become a welfare provider, and such reliefs were the responsibilities of the state and local governments and philanthropic organizations. Hoover signed the Republican-sponsored Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law in June 1930, although he was not totally supportive of the legislation and opposed by leading economists. As expected, many nations, especially Canada, France, and Great Britain, retaliated by also raising tariffs on American goods, which weakened the global economy further. Progressive Republicans such as Senator William E. Borah of Idaho were outraged when Hoover signed the Tariff Act, and Hoover's relations with that wing of the party never recovered. Hoover sought to cut immigration to the United States to reduce unemployment, and in 1930 he issued his executive order requiring individuals to have employment before migrating to the United States. Well, times have changed, haven't they? The prosecution of illegal immigrants, which began, most strongly affected Mexican Americans, especially those living in Southern California. Many of the deportations were overseen by state and local authorities who acted on the encouragement of the Hoover administration. Around 1 million Mexican Americans were returned to Mexico, and apparently around 60% were birthright citizens. Citing legal professor Kevin R. Johnson, the repatriation campaign meets the modern legal standards of ethnic cleansing, as it involved the forced removal by a racial minority by government actors. This was one of the many accusations leveled at Hoover. Hoover wanted near total military disarmament to use federal money for domestic projects. Hoover and Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson wanted to extend the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty established to prevent a global naval arms race. The major naval powers signed the 1930 London Naval Treaty, which was the first time that the world's naval powers agreed to cap their tonnage of all ships being built, as previous agreements had only affected capital ships. Hoover proposed more reductions in armaments to include banning of tanks and bomber aircraft at the 1932 World Disarmament Conference, but his proposals were not adopted. The collapse of the Austrian bank Kreditanstalt in May 1931 was just one more blow to the world markets and sent shockwaves throughout Europe and the international financial system. The German financial system was already on life support, and with reparations, their collapse meant that France and Great Britain would be unable to pay their war debts to the U.S. government, while at the same time, German default on the private sector industrial loans would bring down the U.S. banking system. Hoover saw what was coming, and in June 1931 called for a one-year pause in all international debt payments. This move had saved the entire international banking system from collapsing, but it only bought some time. Hoover's darkest legacy was perhaps the bonus Army debacle when thousands of World War I veterans and their families demonstrated and camped out in Washington, D.C. during June 1932. Hoover issued the order to peacefully disband them. See our video on the bonus army. Douglas MacArthur was in command, and he believed it was a communist revolt against the government, and he chose to clear out the camp with military force. Though Hoover had not directly ordered MacArthur's clearing out of the protesters, he endorsed it after the fact. The incident proved somewhat embarrassing for the Hoover administration and seriously hurt his bid for re-election. After Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, Hoover took a hands-off approach while openly dissenting, fearing that such a position would weaken relations and reduce Japan as a possible ally against the Soviets. In response, Hoover and Secretary of State Stimson outlined the Stimson Doctrine, which held that the United States would not recognize territories gained by force. It should be acknowledged that neither President Calvin Coolidge nor Herbert Hoover recognized the Soviet Union as a legitimate country due to the Bolshevik Revolution. Meanwhile, as the Great Depression worsened, the country's homeless population increased, unemployment reached 23%, and Hoover was blamed. Shanty towns and tent cities were called Hoovervilles, and Hoover leather was the name given to cardboard used to cover the soles of shoes, while Hoover blankets were old newspapers used as blankets. Being resistant to federal intervention, in January 1932, Hoover finally convinced Congress to authorize the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Such projects that resulted included the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. This provided government-secured loans to financial institutions, railroads, and local governments, and saved numerous businesses from failure, but it failed to stimulate commercial lending as much as Hoover had hoped, partly because it was run by conservative bankers unwilling to make riskier loans. Hoover then signed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, establishing 12 district banks overseen by a Federal Home Loan Bank Board in a manner similar to the Federal Reserve System. Hoover then pushed the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932, which was designed to extend banking credit by expanding the collateral on which Federal Reserve banks were authorized to lend. When all of these programs failed, Hoover signed the $2 billion Public Emergency Relief and Construction Act in July 1932, creating more work projects to decrease unemployment, such as the Hoover Dam. Hoover tried to stave off a default by any of the major economies and prop up the U.S. banking sector, while attempting to address rising unemployment and the collapse of American agriculture at home, but it was a losing battle. Hoover proposed a tax plan to increase tax revenues by 30% in 1931, which became the Revenue Act of 1932, increasing taxes across the board. The nation's top earners paid 63% on net income, and the top estate tax rate was doubled. This alienated the very wealthy from Hoover and the Republicans. Personal income tax exemptions were drastically reduced, and the corporate income tax exemption was eliminated, while corporate taxes increased, but the deficit still rose. This all also alienated big businesses, driving them into the Democratic camp in the coming election. Hoover was not an avowed racist, despite his previous references to the contrary, as he believed that blacks could improve themselves with education and individual initiative. In fact, Hoover appointed more minorities, especially blacks, to more federal positions than either Presidents Harding and Coolidge combined. But many African-American leaders condemned various aspects of the Hoover administration, including Hoover's unwillingness to push for a federal anti-lynching law. But Hoover also removed blacks from leadership positions in the Republican Party, trying to end the Democratic Party's dominance in the South. Despite Robert Moton and other black leaders agreeing to this move as a temporary measure, most African-American leaders were outraged. Hoover, like many in his day, considered whites to be inherently intellectually superior to blacks and that interracial marriages were bad. He did think education and work would improve black people's standing, hence his support for the Tuskegee Institute as a black college. It was under Hoover that the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was begun in 1932 and conducted by the United States Public Health Service, although without congressional approval. This program lasted until it was abolished by President Richard M. Nixon. See our 2 videos on him. W.E.B. Du Bois described Hoover as an undemocratic racist who saw blacks as a species of sub-men. Hoover's nomination of North Carolina Judge John J. Parker to the Supreme Court further alienated black leaders, but Parker's nomination died in the Senate due to opposition from the NAACP and organized labor. As a result, many black voters switched to the Democratic Party in 1932, along with wealthy business owners, and they helped Franklin Roosevelt win that election. By December 1932, both Britain and France announced that they would likely be unable to make their next debt payments, and on December 14th, the French Chamber of Deputies made it official. France was not able to repay their loans. Hoover's anti-business positions and the perception that he was favoring well-connected banks over the common man saw Republican House Representative Lewis Thomas McFadden of Pennsylvania, who was best known for the 1927 McFadden Act, which helped national banks better compete with state-chartered banks, twice call for the impeachment of President Hoover. He also charged Hoover for overstepping his constitutional role and mishandling the international debts following World War I. McFadden's impeachment resolution included charges of endeavoring to illegally cancel the war debts, undertaking secret conversations with foreign bankers, violating the Constitution by seeking to usurp Congress's role in foreign policy and finance. It also included the charges of inflicting suffering on the American people through the moratorium for the benefit of the debtor nations, as well as Hoover's federal appointments that McFadden himself personally disapproved of, and Hoover's handling of the bonus Army veterans. The impeachment proceedings were tabled in the House of Representatives and died a natural death because 6 weeks later, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. Hoover strongly criticized Roosevelt's foreign policy and the New Deal. Afterward, Hoover's image was elevated in the 1940s and 50s due to his work in the Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower administrations, which included chairing the Hoover Commission. The Great Depression had been blamed mostly on Hoover, although those seeds were planted long before he became president. Due to the heavy pressures worldwide, every nation that owed the U.S. had defaulted on their obligations, with exception to Finland. Hoover could have done nothing about it. Hoover's re-election campaign was faced with perhaps the most hostile crowds ever seen by a sitting president, as his train and motorcades were pelted with eggs and rotten fruit. He was often heckled while speaking, and on several occasions, the Secret Service halted attempts to harm him. One event included the Secret Service capturing a man coming near Hoover carrying sticks of dynamite, and another already having removed several spikes from the rails in the front of the president's train. Hoover was blamed for every failure in the country, and in the electoral vote, Hoover lost 59 to 472, carrying only 6 states. Hoover won 39.6% of the popular vote, a plunge of 18.6 percentage points from his result in the 1928 election. Hoover remained active in politics for many years and backed conservative Robert A. Taft in the 1952 Republican National Convention, but Dwight D. Eisenhower won that presidential nomination and also the 1952 election. President John F. Kennedy offered Hoover various positions in his administration, which he declined, but he defended Kennedy following the Bay of Pigs invasion. See our video on that event also. In retirement, Hoover wrote several books, including The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, where he defended Wilson's actions at the Paris Peace Conference, believing that if Wilson had been supported by the Senate, World War II could have been averted, and your humble narrator believes that is very viable. In 1944, he began working on Freedom Betrayed, where he criticized Roosevelt's foreign policy, especially Roosevelt's decision to recognize the Soviet Union in order to provide aid to that country during World War II. He was also critical of FDR's gold confiscation policy. Historian Richard Pipes commented on Hoover's efforts while leading the American Relief Administration, quote, "Many statesmen occupy a prominent place in history for having sent millions to their death. Herbert Hoover, maligned for his performance as president and soon forgotten in Russia, has the rare distinction of having saved millions." Hoover has been called a humanitarian, a globalist, a racist, a bigot, a savior, and an icon, depending upon the sources. All said and done, he was a man of his times, and it would appear that, for all of his faults, he was considerably better than some, but we will let you decide. Herbert Hoover died in New York City on October 20th, 1964, following massive internal bleeding due to intestinal cancer. He was both revered and reviled from both sides of the political aisle. History will eventually be the final judge.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.